Hello everybody, and welcome to another one of my videos looking at Tudor history. So today we're going to look at Henry VIII, and we're answering the question, how did relations with foreign powers change and how was the succession secured? We're looking at in particular the years 1509 to 1529, so we're looking at this first part of his reign, the bit that's pre-Wolsey and then the Wolsey bit. And then I'll do a separate video where we look at the foreign policy and succession in the second part of his reign. Now, the beginning part of this, there is a bit of an issue really, because we start off with the foreign policy aims of Henry. He wanted to be the warrior king. He commissioned a translation of the warlike Henry V. He wanted to recreate these kind of successes, particularly against France. He wanted to take French territory. He believed a claim on the French throne, and he wanted England to be a really strong international power. Now, the problem we're going to see with foreign policy with Henry VIII is his ambitions are not necessarily matched by the country's ability, and particularly its position in the power relationship with the other players in Europe. So early events. To start off, we've got the renewal of the Treaty of VIII, which is a treaty with France which goes back to the reign of Henry VII, and it includes a really generous pension for the English king. But Henry then enters the anti-French alliance, the Holy League with Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice and the papacy. And in 1512 he sent 10,000 men to southwest France. They didn't really achieve very much themselves, but you could argue this distracted the French briefly, as Ferdinand then conquered the region of Navarre. And so we see some benefit from it, but not really for England. Henry then leads a force himself into northeastern France. He wins the Battle of the Spurs. Again, there's a bit of debate about this. Is this the great battle that it's portrayed at in propaganda, or is it a minor skirmish which they happen to come out on top of? They then capture two towns, Thuan and Tournai, and again, these aren't massive gains, but they're symbolic to Henry. It's something Henry feels massively popular about. He really kind of gives a lot of credit to Wolsey for all of this as well. So he's had some success. The biggest success, however, in 1513 was the Battle of Flodden, which takes place whilst Henry's in France. James IV of Scotland crosses the border with a substantial force. It's defeated by a small English force under the Earl of Surrey. The army is inspired by Catherine, makes a speech, and James and much of the Scottish nobility are killed. So this is a really significant victory, and probably the most significant victory of Henry's early reign, but not one he can take enormous credit for. Now, the result of all this was just a huge amount of expense. Henry spent £960,000 on wars in the years 1511 to 1513. His ordinary income was £110,000 a year. So he's spending 3 times his annual income. So he has to liquidate a load of the assets and stuff that he's inherited from his father. So the really careful financial management of Henry VII we're seeing being blown by the foreign policy of Henry VIII. There's a return of social unrest in Yorkshire caused by taxation. There's a loss of the French pension, so we've got yet more drop in revenue. And eventually Tournai will be sold back to France at half the cost of what the English spent on building up the defences after they'd laid siege and taken it. Now, rather disastrously for Henry, in 1514 Ferdinand, who's king of Spain, and Maximilian, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, make peace with France. I'm trying to, as you'll see as we go through the video, I'm trying to keep track of the different countries by using these different colours. So, Wolsey had impressed Henry with his organisation of the French expedition of 1513, but Wolsey now has this really difficult job of managing Henry's expectations in foreign policy, as Henry believed that England was much more powerful than it actually was. Now, Spain is even worse. By 1514, England had essentially run out of money. However, Henry's ambitions don't diminish. He doesn't turn around and go, oh, we've not got enough money, I can't do what I want. Or we're not got the strength of army, I can't do what I want. He still is making the demands, and Wolsey's position is completely reliant on him giving Henry what Henry wants. There's also the old alliance between France and Scotland that made action against either very, very difficult. So England can't really exploit Scottish weakness at this point with the infant James V on the throne. And there is peace sought with France. Henry's younger sister Mary is married, albeit rather briefly, to King Louis of France, because they marry in October 1514 and he dies at the beginning of January 1515. She then quickly marries an English nobleman, and that kind of takes her out of the game in terms of using her in international diplomacy. Now, we then go through a real kind of complicated change in European rulers, and this really does actually damage Henry's position. I've tried to keep track of this using the different colours. Charles, you'll see, becomes very colourful because he ends up in charge of everything. So Louis XII dies in 1515, and his throne goes to the young and dynamic, ambitious and aggressive in foreign policy King Francis I. Ferdinand of Aragon dies in 1516 and is succeeded by his grandson Charles V, who has already inherited Burgundy from Philip in 1506. Charles then immediately sought an alliance with France. In 1517, Maximilian had agreed the Treaty of Cambrai with France, and he would die 2 years later in 1519 and would be succeeded by Charles V, who now in my video is going to be multicoloured because he's not only in charge of Spain, he's also head of the Holy Roman Empire. So he's the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, and so this is concentrating a huge amount of power in his hand, and this is really going to make it very difficult for Henry to manoeuvre in the European arena, because you've got two powerful forces, the French and Charles, and doing anything is very difficult. Now we've also got the Duke of Albany, who's a French nobleman who is essentially the heir apparent to the Scottish throne unless James V has children. And there's great division amongst the Scottish nobility, but none of this Henry can really exploit, and he's really worried about French influence in Scotland. And so he's becoming rather dangerously isolated, and Europe is dominated by these two very young, thrusting, ambitious young monarchs, Francis I of France and Charles V of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. In 1518, we see an absolute masterstroke on behalf of Wolsey. It is something that puts England absolutely front and centre in European policy, and it brings great glory to Henry without actually having to do any fighting or spending any money. So Pope Leo X wanted to unite Christian Europe against the threat of the Ottoman Turks, and it all then comes from some negotiations of peace between England and France that have been developed. It broadens into a wider kind of treaty of perpetual peace amongst all the European states. It's signed by England, by France, by Spain, by the Holy Roman Empire, and of a whole range of other European states. Each country or each state that signed the treaty did so individually with England, placing Wolsey and Henry at the centre of European diplomacy. The Pope is hugely grateful to England and Wolsey, who he makes papal legate for England. And so we get reflective glory in all of this for Henry, and that makes him very happy, and that means that he rewards Wolsey, and Wolsey is at the absolute height of his powers, 1518. Now, we then see the Treaty of Bruges, which is signed between Wolsey and negotiated between Wolsey and Charles V in 1521. Now, the aim was to improve relations with the Pope, who wanted to reduce French control of northern Italy. You'll see lots of stuff where the Pope is worried about one or other of the great powers controlling northern Italy. Henry is really hopeful of gaining territory in northern France. There was a marriage alliance proposed between Mary, who, remember, is half Spanish. She is Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, and therefore is related to Charles. and the marriage never actually happens, though she does eventually marry Charles's son Philip, but we'll look at that much later in the course when we get on to Mary's reign. So Charles was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, and therefore is a cousin of Mary. The English armies invade France in 1522 and 1523, but don't really achieve a lot other than running up huge expenses, which Parliament is unwilling to fund, which leads Wolsey to the amicable grant of 1525, which again causes unrest and problems back home. Charles's army crushes the French at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. Henry thinks he can get in on this and so suggests joint action against France with Charles, and so hoping to take some of this northern territory that he's really after. And Charles says no. So Charles also at this point backs out his marriage alliance to Mary, and so Henry really has his nose pointed out a joint and decides to look for alliances elsewhere, and he gets involved with the League of Cognac, which is organised by the Pope to counter Charles's dominance in northern Italy. As you can see, the Pope's never quite happy. He a few years earlier was unhappy about French control of northern Italy, and now he's unhappy about the dominance of Charles in northern Italy. So we then move into the stuff to do with the great matter with Henry, and we see a kind of variety of diplomatic manoeuvres, and he can't sort out his great matter diplomatically, and this really again shows England is a really minor power. The Treaty of Amiens in 1527 is an anti-imperial alliance with France, includes a trade embargo on Burgundy, but this backfires when Charles economically retaliates, and this has terrible impact on the English cloth industry and causes mass unemployment. In 1529 there's the Battle of Landriano, in which Charles defeats the French, and he essentially holds the Pope captive. The Peace of Cambrai between France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain is then signed. France gives up its ambition in Italy. The papacy is dominated by Charles and the Holy Roman Empire. And now Charles is not definitively, he's not going to allow the divorce of his aunt Catherine from Henry, and therefore Henry's position has been completely unravelled, and he is isolated. He's essentially powerless in all of this, and Wolsey pays the price. So we're seeing a real kind of collapse in terms of Henry's foreign policy at this point. He is not achieving all the things that he's setting out to do. So, right, thank you very, very much for watching. That is the first part of Henry VIII's foreign policy. Make sure that you like this video. Please comment, leave me any feedback, any questions, and make sure you subscribe to support the channel and to make sure you get notifications of upcoming videos. So, for example, the second part of this on Henry's foreign policy. Again, thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you all again soon.